and welcome to episode 21 of the Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past, and another instalment of a 12-part series entitled A Spring of Classical Arabic Poetry with Dr. Kevin Blankinship at Brigham Young University in Utah. Part 3, Abū Nuwās, 756 to 814 Common Era, Life, Works and Legacy of a Hedonist. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host, Al Hassan, a PhD student at the School of African Studies in London. Now on to the show. Born in modern-day Iran, Al-Hasan ibn Hani al-Hakami, better known as Abū Nuwās, literally he of the curly locks, would scandalize Abbasid society with drunken exploits and homoerotic verse. To discuss with me the life, work and legacy of Abū Nuwās is Dr. Kevin Blankinship. Welcome, Dr. Blankinship.
Hi, Talha. Good to be with you.
Abū Nuwās lived during what is often dubbed the golden age of Islamdom, during the fabled reign of Harun al-Rashid of 1001 Nights fame. How would you characterize the social, political and cultural context of this remarkable poet?
He was born into what historians call al-Asr al-Abbasi al-Awwal, the early Abbasid period. This period saw remarkable changes going back to the Abbasid Revolution, which resulted in the movement of the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, as well as the creation of new bureaucratic positions like vizier and qadi, which embodied sort of an overall centralization of government during this time. It also saw greater reliance on non-Arabs and especially Persians who came to occupy some of these important government positions I just mentioned. But to the extent that the latter felt themselves to be second-class citizens despite their increased political and cultural influence, they responded with what became known as Shu'ubiyya, a term that will be familiar to listeners and which denotes a movement within early Muslim society which denied any privileged position to Arabs. Abū Nuwās has sometimes been considered by literary history to be an adherent of the Shu'ubiyya because he, in his poetry, mentions the glory of pre-Islamic Persian kings and inserts Persian words into some of his poems, and because of that, these poems are known as Farisiyat. Most likely, however, his Persian allusions are a reflection of the cultural background of the early Abbasid era in which the influence of the Persian element gradually increased. The fact that he was a staunch partisan of Southern Arab tribal affiliation shows that he considered himself an Arab first and foremost. You mentioned Harun al-Rashid. Under his reign, Baghdad flourished into a center for the arts and culture, but Harun's era was also one of unrest, let us not forget. As in the Umayyad era, there was a north-south tribal dichotomy that prevailed over early Abbasid society, in which, to use Philip Kennedy's apt comparison, constituted a kind of Jets versus Sharks gang rivalry, and it even led to armed tribal conflicts in Syria. Abū Nuwās was a partisan of the Southern Arabs, which we'll talk about in a minute. Harun al-Rashid also stressed the religious nature of the caliphate and continued policies that discriminated against religious minorities like Alids, Dhimmis, and non-Muslims. So, for example, in 806 Common Era, he ordered churches along the Muslim Byzantine frontiers to be destroyed and ordered Dhimmis of Baghdad to wear different clothes from those of Muslims and to ride different animals. All of these policies, but as well as cultural flourishing, demographic changes, and political turmoil as backdrop to the life and literary career of Abū Nuwās.
Born to a Persian mother and Arab father, he spent a life of hedonism before apparently dying penitent in prison. What do we know about the life of Abū Nuwās?
He was born in the province of Ahvaz and died in Baghdad. And his father belonged to the army of the last Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, and was a Mawla of Jarrah ibn Abdullah al-Hakami, who came from the southern Arabian tribe of Sa'ad ibn Ashira. While he was still very young, Abū Nuwās lost his father, and so his mother moved with her child to Basra, where Abū Nuwās attended Quran school. During this time, he made a fateful encounter with the poet Waliba ibn al-Hubab, who was one of two very important influences on Abū Nuwás's life and literary career. So as I mentioned, Abū Nuwās attended lectures on Quran, Hadith, philology, and grammar, but one of his most important teachers was this Waliba, who composed Bacchic, amatory, and lewd poems, and who is said to have had an erotic relationship with young Abū Nuwās. There's a story, according to one tradition, where the two men drank together and ate, and when Abū Nuwās started removing his clothes, Waliba saw his beautiful body and kissed his rear end, at which point Abū Nuwās farted in his face. Waliba cursed him for being so vulgar, but Abū Nuwās came back with a maxim: what reward can there be for the one who kisses ass except a fart? So this is obviously shows that Abū Nuwās could be rude and kind of petty, I guess, or trifling, but it's important to know that he's known in literary history for outwitting his associates. So after Waliba's death in about 786 or 787 Common Era, Abū Nuwās then took another teacher, the poet and Rawi Khalaf al-Ahmar, and this is the second great influence on his literary career and life. And there's an incident in their association that's become legendary. When the young Abū Nuwās asked Khalaf for permission to compose poetry of his own poetry, Khalaf al-Ahmar told him, only after you've memorized 1,000 ancient poems. Abū Nuwās went away and then came back and told Khalaf that he had indeed memorized the amount that he had asked. He recited them out loud over several days, and then asked again whether he could write his own poetry. Khalaf now came back and said that what you have to do is forget everything that you've just memorized in order to be able to write your own poetry. What this shows is that Abū Nuwās was impacted by the tradition that came before him, but was not held in its thrall. He takes what the poems and motifs and traditions that were written before him and plays with them and adds to them in his own way. Abū Nuwās then went to Baghdad to gain the favor of Harun al-Rashid and his courtiers, the Barmakids. And apparently Abū Nuwās had a strained relationship with the caliph, who imprisoned Abū Nuwās twice. Once because of a blasphemous verse, and another time because of a satire against the northern Arabs. And because of this, after his first stint in prison, Abū Nuwās spent time in exile in Egypt, where he wrote some praise poems to the head of the Diwan al-Kharaj, al-Khasib ibn Abd al-Hamid. And when this al-Khasib lost his post, Abū Nuwās returned to Baghdad. This was in 806 Common Era, where he was put in prison yet a second time. Harun al-Rashid died in 809 Common Era, and his son al-Amin freed Abū Nuwās from prison and made him a boon companion at court. And the ensuing years were probably the most brilliant of the poet's life, but even so, al-Amin forbade him from drinking wine and supposedly put him in prison on that account. In response to al-Ma'mun al-Khurasan, his brother and rival for the throne, who tried to exploit al-Amin's connections with Abū Nuwās in propaganda against him. And Abū Nuwās died after some months of illness during the Great Abbasid Civil War, also known as the Fourth Fitna, before al-Ma'mun advanced from Khurasan this would be around 814 to 816 Common Era.
He's particularly known for his homoerotic verse and wine poetry, but he also has some religious verse too. How do we characterize his works?
According to the Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim, his diwan was gathered in a few versions, and 3 of them are still around today. There's the version by Abu Bakr Asuli, who put the sections of poetry in alphabetical order and tried to eliminate any spurious poems that were not actually written by Abū Nuwās. The second is by Hamza al-Isfahani, whose collection is about 3 times as large as Asuli's. He wasn't as judicious about removing things attributed to Abū Nuwās, but which might be spurious. This version also has akhbar, anecdotes, and some commentary in certain sections. And then a third version, probably compiled by Ibrahim ibn Ahmad al-Tabari Tuzun, which is about the size of Asuli's. There's also a very early collection of akhbar about Abū Nuwās, made by Abu Hifan al-Mihzami, who knew the poet personally, and then a second one collected later by Ibn Manzur, who is most famous for being the author of the Lisan al-Arab dictionary. As you mentioned, Talha, literary history has judged Abū Nuwās to be at his best when he's writing about wine in his Khamriyat. And he certainly wasn't the first person to compose this kind of poetry, but he, more than anyone else, exhausted its themes, describing and praising wine for its color, its sparkling, its age, talking about its effects on the drinker, the wineskin, the cup bearer, the tavern, its keeper, the monastery, and gardens, and giving dramatic descriptions of drinking binges and nights spent carousing. This is, a rightly deserved place in the Arabic literary canon for this kind of poetry. But Abū Nuwās is probably one of the most versatile poets in classical Arabic, and he helped pioneer several theme-based genres. They include the tardiyat, hunting poems describing the hunt itself, the animals. This is a genre worthy of consideration. He also wrote a lot of insult poetry, hijab, and normally treated the same themes as other poets. This is also true of his marathi, his elegies for the dead, including one for Harun al-Rashid, that may have just been an opportunity for the poet to praise that caliph, but may also have something to do with the real ties and real affection between the two men. So just two lines from that elegy in the translation of Philip Kennedy. People are divided between the glad and the saddened, and the sick man who is ransomed to the palm of death. But who can now be gladdened with this world and its gaiety after the passing of the blessed Harun? And of course, you mentioned love poetry. So Abū Nuwās wrote poems about men as much as about women. In fact, there are probably twice as many poems about men and boys as there are about girls, including sort of a subgenre or sub-theme, sometimes known by the word Suryaniyat, poems that address Christian boys. And these poems might end either in attaining the sought-after goal of union with the beloved, or in an embarrassing fiasco for the poet. Abū Nuwās is also one of a few poets credited with inventing the mu'amma, which is a riddle solved by combining constituent letters of a word or name to be found. In his praise poetry, Madih, Abū Nuwās still often used the classical form of the qasida with the nasib, the journey section, camel description, and the eulogy itself, or other themes. But the nasib became an arena of change for Abū Nuwās. Aside from starting with the old style lament over the deserted camping place, or atlal, he began some of his poems with a rejection of this lamentation, and even ridiculed the Bedouin way of life. And instead, he wept for the taverns that had disappeared and lamented the absent boon companions, drinking companions, and the nights spent in those taverns. And you mentioned religious poetry. This is, I think, an important aspect of Abū Nuwás's career to remember, and to remember that a good poet in classical Arabic was able to compose in various genres, including genres that seem to contradict each other. So Abū Nuwās has many zuhdiyat, sort of world-denying poetry or pious poems. And world-denying as a pose or a stance is a short jump from hedonism, since hedonism is often attached to the idea that life is short and tomorrow fate comes, death comes. So let's drink up and enjoy the moment. The difference obviously is in whether the fact of life's transience means we should resist earthly pleasures or embrace them. Either way, Abū Nuwās did meditate on what happens after this life. He wasn't anti-religious per se, is important to point out. He wasn't irreligious in the sense that he belonged to a heretical group. Rather, any anti-religiosity that comes across was a kind of affected irreverence, as well as his reliance on God's clemency as an excuse for being able to engage in behaviors that he wanted to. At any rate, here's an elegant example of one of his poems written in the ascetic mode. And again, this is in Philip Kennedy's translation. Every mourner will be mourned. Every weeper will be wept for. Every saving will be spent, and every memory forgotten. Only God remains. Whoever is exalted, God is more exalted. Good and evil have features that cannot be concealed. Whosoever hides behind a cover in God's sight will be revealed. None of the things you see can be hidden from God.
In the lyrics to the song Taif, or Ghost, by the Beirut-based indie rock band Mashrou' Layla. One hears, according to an English rendition, our hips translated Sappho and Abū Nuwās in the tongue of oohs and ahs on bedsheets embroidered with the same oohs and ahs we chanted at the picket line. There can be a sense that Abū Nuwās is some kind of proto-Stonewall hero, and yet his amorous poetry, not on a few occasions, are directed towards a pubescent or prepubescent male, which in our societies, both you and I sit in, find vehemently unacceptable. How do you see Abū Nuwās' legacy, and where would you recommend interested listeners turn to learn more about this remarkable poet?
The point about Abū Nuwās' continued celebrity despite his scandalous reputation was brought home to me personally by one of my own Arabic teachers, Nagwa Sabr of Alexandria University in Egypt. After reading some lines by Abū Nuwās as a class, I asked her privately about his status in the Arab world. And she said, and this is indicative, I think, of someone with a higher than average education level in any society, not just the Middle East, that Arabs today are proud of Abū Nuwās as part of the cultural tradition, and that they're able to recognize his aesthetic and cultural contribution despite his having said and done things that might offend traditional Muslim sensibilities. But not everyone feels so sanguine about Abū Nuwās. He's a regular target of political activists. In January 2001, the Egyptian Ministry of Culture, which at the time was led by Farouk Hosni, who has been roundly criticized for censorship, ordered the burning of some 6,000 books by Abū Nuwās. More recently, in September 2018, some unidentified protesters vandalized the statue of Abū Nuwās in Baghdad, which is located on Abū Nuwās Street, ironically. They removed the goblet held in one hand and broke off the fingers that held it. And this was part of a wave of attacks on statues, monuments, and murals across Iraq that was and is starting to look more and more like a systematic and ongoing campaign. On the point of his sexuality and whether he's to be a prototype of LGBTQ rights, it's important to remember the point that Khalid al-Ruwayhib makes in his book, Before Homosexuality in the Arab Islamic World, which is that there's a seeming paradox in pre-modern Islamic civilization when it comes to same-sex attraction and culture, that it's visible and tolerated on the one hand, and yet prohibited by Islam on the other. And what Professor al-Ruwayhib tells us is that this apparent paradox is based on the assumption, and it's an anachronistic one, that homosexuality is a timeless, self-evident fact to which a particular culture reacts with some degree of tolerance or intolerance. So I think that's important to keep in mind, is that these things are obviously fluid categories and change through time. Two more points that I wanted to make about this. One is that we should resist what sociologist Liliana Mason called mega identities. This is a term that refers to the fact that just one data point, let's say sexual identity, then determines everything else about your life: the political party you vote for, the clothes you wear, the cars you drive, the stores you shop at. But once we start thinking this way, it adds to not only limited thinking about history and culture, but in our own time, it adds to increased hostility and polarization. In Abū Nuwās' case, he was famous for his love of men as much as of women, but he was also, as a person of his time and place, well-versed in religious learning, and in fact transmitted hadith. To us today, those two things might seem contradictory, but at the time they weren't. So it's important to resist these mega identities that we've constructed. The other point that I wanted to make is, if we hold up Abū Nuwās or any historical figure as representative of something beyond himself or herself, we run into a kind of faith crisis similar to those who practice religion, which is that they have to reconcile the messiness of historical reality with a more sanitized portrait. So we should be careful about making plastic idols out of people who lived in a time and place and whose lives were, fraught with contradictions, just like anyone's life is. You can champion human rights and at the same time pay tribute to realities that are complicated and rich. I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. In the imagination of the Arab world, Abū Nuwās is intimately connected with Harun al-Rashid, who in turn personifies the glory of the caliphate. So most famously, Abū Nuwās appears in Arabian Nights, the 1001 Arabian Nights, but there are dozens of stories about him at the court, quoted in sources like Ibn al-Mu'taz's Tabaqat al-Shura, or the Halbat al-Kumayt by Shamsuddin al-Nawaji. And so there's an anecdote in the latter work illustrates this. One day, supposedly, Harun al-Rashid gave away one of his singing girls and then came across her circling around the palace. So the caliph tried to seduce her, and she said, "Oh, commander of the faithful, you've given me away all this time and I have received no word from you. So grant me a delay tonight so I can fix myself up to meet you, and I'll come to you tomorrow." When it was morning, Harun al-Rashid told his chamberlain, "Don't let anyone come in to me." And he waited for her, but she didn't come. So he got up and went in to her where she was and asked her about their rendezvous. And she said, "Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, kalam al-layl yamhuhu an-nahar." What's spoken at night, the day then erases. So he retreated her from her door, meaning she didn't want to meet with him anymore. She just said what she said in the heat of the moment at night, and she regretted what she'd said. So he retreated and called for whichever poets were outside. In came Abū Nuwās al-Raqashi and Mus'ab, and the caliph said, "Each of you say a few lines ending on kalam al-layl yamhuhu an-nahar." And so this is often a trope in these stories about Abū Nuwās and other poets, which is that Harun al-Rashid calls in some poets on some theme or a line or something like that and instigates a poetry contest. In this story, Abū Nuwās wins the grand prize, which is 10,000 dirhams, while the other two poets both win 5,000 dirhams apiece. In these stories also, Harun al-Rashid always gives something to all the poets, even if he gives more to one of them for winning. And up to the present day, the name Abū Nuwās stands for wine drinking, debauchery, verbal prowess, joie de vivre, and social elegance, or dharf.
Finally, let's end with a sample and translation from our subject today, Abū Nuwās.
So today, the poem, which is often Baudelarized, that I want to read, has two of Abū Nuwás's most famous lines in them. And in this poem, the poet pits a radiant wine against the Mu'tazilite theologian Ibrahim an-Navam. So he's defending wine against this theologian on the grounds that one of the Mu'tazilism's tenets is that God does not forgive grave sins, kaba'ir, only small misdemeanors, sagha'ir. And if this is what you believe, says Abū Nuwās to the would-be philosopher, you have learned some things, but much more escapes you. Hafidhta shay'an wa ghabat anka ashya'u. This is one of the most famous lines from this poem. More than that, Abū Nuwās concludes that taking away his pleasure, i.e. stopping him from drinking wine, is itself a crime because it robs him of the chance for God to forgive him. So, the first line of this poem in Arabic, and then an English translation by Alex Roll, who's the managing editor of Al Jumhuriyya English. First line in Arabic. دع عنك لومي فإن اللوم إغراء وداوني بالتي كانت هي الداء. Cease your reproach, for reproach is but temptation, and cure me with the very cause of my debilitation. Yellow-hued, no sorrow possible from it. In cold stone would it inspire elation. Poured from the palm of a girl dressed as a boy, an intrigue for one of any orientation. She lifts the carafe to the black night, her face lit with brilliant radiation, sending from the jug a stream so bright, eyes in its glare close as in sedation. Wine so fine, so pure and delicate, to add watered be contamination. With light alone may it be mixed, emitting dazzling illumination. Passed between lads who've humbled time itself, so it afflicts them only with their aspirations. For this I do weep, not a campsite at which Hind and Asma once did station. God forbid Durra should dwell among tents, amid sheep's and camels' fragrant emanations. Tell then him who claims learning and philosophy, knowing one thing doesn't make an education. Don't forbid forgiveness if you choose to abstain, for that forbiddance is of faith desecration. And for more information, listeners can look at Alex Roll's collection of translated poems by Abū Nuwās, plus a wonderful introduction. The book is called Vintage Humor. And I would also recommend two books by Philip Kennedy, his academic study, The Wine Song and Classical Arabic Poetry, and a shorter, more accessible study on Abū Nuwās by One World called Abū Nuwās, A Genius of Poetry.
Dr. Blankinship, thank you so much.
Thank you, Talha.